Thank you, Mr President. This motion is in response to the ongoing apathy with which this government is treating the state's mental health crisis. It speaks to the findings and recommendations of the unmet mental service needs in South Australia that could be met by the NGO sector report or the unmet needs report, which I understand was finally provided to government in February of 2023. It was commissioned by the Office of the Chief Psychiatrist, and it outlines a host of damning evidence detailing the serious lack of psychosocial supports of South Australians in need. The report was released publicly many months after the ink dried, following repeated efforts and pressure from stakeholder groups and interest groups. And, Mr President, many months later, we're still waiting for a response from the government. 19,000 South Australians, likely more, are still waiting for a response. At least 19,000 South Australians with severe mental illness require psychosocial support each year, but are failing to have their needs met. An estimated $125 million each year is required to address this unmet need. They were the findings in the report. The follow-on effects of addressing this unmet need include reduced ambulance ramping and ED wait times. We've fleshed this out in this place 1,000 times. We know that if we deal with mental health in the community through appropriate psychosocial supports and therapies and programs, people do not end up on a ramp and people do not end up in an emergency department. That is the one single factor that has absolutely crippled our health system and contributed to our health crisis. So to not even attempt to address this shortfall is, with respect, an utter disgrace, because the moral dimension is clear. These are our people who we have a duty to provide for. In the language of many decision makers in the state, they couldn't fit in Cooper's, formerly Hindmarsh Stadium. I've heard anecdotally they would probably fill Adelaide Oval. And it is undeniably written in black and white in the report, there is a mental health crisis in this state, one which we have been warned is going to get worse in the next 3 to 5 years following COVID. So what did the government do in the 23-24 budget to address this? Delay a response. Fast forward another 12 months to the 24-25 budget. What did the government do to address the need, which was undoubtedly increased? Again, provide no additional investment in psychosocial support services. We've seen delay after delay after delay. According to the Australian College of Emergency Medicine, our state has the highest percentage of patients presenting with mental health and behavioural problems in the nation. And that report was published in 2022. So it was well known before, even last year's budget, that the efficacy of our emergency departments was being compromised by a negligent approach to mental health. This is not a report that has been done by anybody. This is a report that was commissioned and done by the state's chief psychiatrist. That's whose findings and recommendations the government has not responded to date. The government... My colleague interjects, sadly for him, and says that this is a federal issue, but he couldn't be more incorrect. And in fact, given that we have had that helpful interjection, I will enlighten my colleague that there have been discussions. About sharing the load between state and federal. The NGOs themselves have said, hey, state government, you put up 65, the feds can put up the balance, you can share the load between you. And even to that proposal, where we're sharing the load between state and federal, in a jurisdiction that this state does have responsibility for, the state government still has not replied to this unmet need. So hope that no one notices, because it's not in vogue, but I'm not going to say ambulance ramping too many times. I'm sure there are others in this place who will in due course, but I will remind those sitting next to me that a major contributor to our overflowing emergency departments are presentations requiring psychosocial supports. are presentations of mental illness that could have been prevented had those services been available in the first place. We've heard from the President of the Mental Health Coalition of South Australia, who has said publicly, who has expressed publicly on behalf of the 30 or 40 NGOs that the coalition represents, not one or two or three or four or five or six, at least 30 or 40, and who hold seats federally in the same sort of roles. His disappointment with the state government, who are only too happy to pass the report on to the federal government, only to then suffer collective amnesia. The Mental Health Coalition has urged the government to get the ball rolling by investing 50% of the nearly $125 million in 23-24 mid-budget review, rather than wait for the feds to do anything. The coalition's president, frustration, laid out the farcical nature of the government's inaction. He has said, while we are after leadership, what we are getting is political theatre. A response that points to a generational investment in something other than mental health is not a good enough response. Sending the report to the Commonwealth with no agreements on funding and timeframes leaves the burden in our community, a burden which we know is faced by at least 19,000 people, not to mention the ripple effect that that has on everybody around them. Oftentimes, what hits the media is the person who commits a significant crime, and the headline in the paper is mental illness, and that's what people think mental illness is. It's the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. It waits until things are so critical that there is nothing to be done apart from pick the person up from the bottom of the cliff. But what we are talking about is stopping people from climbing that hill, climbing the hill that leads to the cliff in the first place. Mr. President, the Unmet Needs report is completely unambiguous in inserting that the state and Commonwealth governments need to work together. This isn't a federal issue. They need to work together to fund the necessary reform. And needless to say, handing over to the Commonwealth and neglecting to even issue a formal response is astonishingly poor form, and with respect, is disrespectful to the Chief Psychiatrist of this state, who's pulled together this work and made these recommendations and findings. It also underscores Mr. Creedon's public sentiment that while solving this crisis does require both jurisdictions to fix the problem, we are deeply disappointed with the pass the buck attitude we have seen, especially since the crisis has been known since 2019 and we still have no agreement between governments, and there is no relief in sight and no date when services will hit the ground. Now, they are comments that Mr. Creedon has made available publicly, in addition to other comments that he's made before bodies in this place. I'll conclude my remarks shortly, but first I want to remind members that this is, again, 19,000 South Australians we are talking about at least, so they don't forget, because frankly, that's how they've been treated by this government. They've been forgotten, they've been left behind, and they've been hung out to dry. And perhaps the Malinauskas Labor government should take a second to consider if there's anything crucial they've forgotten to include in their budget before boasting about forecasted surpluses. Something along the lines of a report released last year, sitting around gathering dust on a desk somewhere in this building with no response apparently imminent. With those words, I look forward to the support of this place in directing the government to provide a formal response to the Unmet Needs report by 1 September of this year. And that gives the winter break for all concerned to consider how to meet the unequivocal needs of so many South Australians.